Many in the comments criticize us for defending Biden. We don't. In the Visual family, we are not committed to anyone. Proof of this is this visual economic video where we were not exactly kind to the government of this president. And this one. And this one. And this one. Nevertheless, at the same time, we have two things to say. First, that in foreign policy, this administration has been very effective. And second, although internally there are things we like more and things we like less, it's undeniable that from the point of view of the Democratic voter, Biden has been a tremendously effective president. He's practically been able to get through his entire legislative agenda. Despite this, now the debate over his continuity has set the Democratic Party ablaze. More and more leaders of his own party are asking Joe Biden to step aside. That's precisely why we had to make this video. In the next few minutes, we'll tell you what is happening in the Democratic ranks. We will analyze all the key issues. We'll take a look at what could happen if Biden steps aside. And of course, we'll also tell you what we at VisualPolitik think about this issue. And I think many of you are going to be surprised. I'm pretty certain that the comment section of this video is going to be red hot. Sit up and pay attention because there has to be a change in the electoral race. The question is, has the Biden era come to an end? Let's begin. The knives have begun to fly in the Democratic ranks. The troops are revealing themselves, and more leaders are telling Joe Biden loud and clear that he has to go. And we're not talking about isolated cases. We're talking about a real rebellion throughout the party. Congressmen, senators, donors, and even journalists. More and more people are demanding, crying out for change. And they do so with messages as clear as this one.
I have great respect for President Biden. He saved our country from a tyrant. He is a man of uncommon decency. He cares deeply about our democracy and has been one of the best presidents of our time. But he needs to reassess whether he is the best candidate to do so. In my view, he is not. For the good of the country, I'm calling on President Biden to withdraw from the race.
In the same vein, on the 17th of July, California Senate candidate and an influential guy in the Democratic Party, Adam Schiff, was also equally clear.
While the choice to withdraw from the campaign is President Biden's alone, I believe it is time for him to pass the torch, and in doing so, secure his legacy of leadership by allowing us to defeat Donald Trump in the upcoming election.
These are just two examples, but the list is long. Very long. And the worst thing is that it just keeps growing. Even Nancy Pelosi herself, or Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, are already moving to get Biden to step aside once and for all, whether he wants to or not. Things have gotten out of hand. I've already told you that the Democratic Party has imploded. And what can I say? All of this is something that we could not have even imagined just a few months ago when Biden was cleaning up in the primaries. However, the first debate against Trump changed everything. And not so much because of what he said, but mainly because of the bad image Biden gave. We all saw an exhausted and depleted president. Do you want us to remind you what it was like? You can do it yourselves.
Make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID. Excuse me, with dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicaid.
For months, doubts about the energy and capacity of a very elderly president has been up for discussion. But following the debate you have seen, the doubts have multiplied like mushrooms in the middle of spring. Now things have reached such an extreme that every press conference, every speech, and every appearance by Biden is closely scrutinized to see whether or not he is fit for the presidency. Of course, whether he is or not. The very fact that every step Biden takes is scrutinized is proof that this is a losing battle. For many Democrats, doubts before the debate have become certainties. And keep in mind, when I say for many, I mean for the overwhelming majority of Democratic voters.
New polling shows a large and growing majority want Biden to step aside. Nearly 2/3 of Democrats said President Biden should step aside and allow the party to select a different nominee.
As you can see, the data is tremendous. The only people who continue to support Biden are African American Democrats. Curious. And of course, the question is that if Biden is struggling to convince his own colleagues, how on earth is he going to be able to convince the rest of the voters? And then to top it all off, came the attack against Trump that came very close to ending the life of the former president and left us with images like this one. Meanwhile, the president is infected by COVID and shows even more weakness. Joe, you haven't had a good run lately. So while Biden is facing a veritable tsunami against him within his own party, basically because most no longer consider him vital enough to be a candidate, let alone president, we have Trump, who seems quite the opposite. The very reincarnation of Captain America. The contrast is enormous. And on top of that, Biden, who doesn't seem like a bad guy, has done perhaps the most honest thing after the assassination attempt. Recognized that things have gotten out of hand, and he hasn't thrown more gasoline on the fire. How is he doing that? Well, by temporarily pulling negative ads against Trump. Ads like this one, in which his campaign had invested tens of millions of dollars.
This election is between a convicted criminal who's only out for himself and a president who's fighting for your family.
But of course, the problem is that this campaign line was practically Biden's only hope for a comeback. Shutting down this campaign has caused Democrats to stop bashing Trump right in the middle of the Republican convention, and Republicans are exploiting it.
Trump calls on nation to stand united after shooting.
And that's not all. To top it all off, see this guy? That's Sean O'Brien. He's the current president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, one of the largest and most influential unions in the United States. Well, to the outrage of virtually the entire Democratic Party, he's participated in the Republican convention. Let's see, he hasn't given his support to Trump, but he did say that he is a strong guy. That, and presence alone, has been a fresh bucket of cold water for the White House. Remember that unions are one of the strong arms of the Democrats, and Biden has been one of the most pro-union presidents in recent decades. A disaster, not least because these unions play an absolutely key role in elections in crucial states like Pennsylvania and Michigan. In other words, Biden's candidacy is taking on water faster than the Titanic. And that's why more and more Democrats want him gone. But there's one problem, and not a small one. Biden doesn't want to leave.
Folks, you probably noticed there's been a lot of speculation lately. What's Joe Biden going to do? Is he going to stay in the race? Is he going to drop out? Here's my answer. I am running, and we're going to win. I'm not going to change that.
It cannot be said more clearly. The president does not want to leave. In a very tense meeting with House representatives, the president went for the jugular of his critics, such as Colorado Rep. Jason Crow. Just look at Biden's scolding of him.
First of all, I think you're dead wrong on national security. You saw what happened recently in terms of the meeting we had with NATO. I put NATO together. Name me a foreign leader who thinks I'm not the most effective leader in the world on foreign policy.
But perhaps where Biden has best expressed his emotions was in a letter he sent in early July to Democratic members of Congress. I think this makes it very clear to us how the current president of the United States of America thinks.
Now that you have returned from the July 4th recess, I want you to know that despite all the speculation in the press and elsewhere, I am firmly committed to staying in this race, to running this race to the end, and to beating Donald Trump. We had a Democratic nomination process, and the voters have spoken clearly and decisively. I received over 14 million votes, 87% of the votes cast across the entire nominating process. I have nearly 3,900 delegates, making me the presumptive nominee of our party by a wide margin. This was a process open to anyone who wanted to run. Only 3 people chose to challenge me. One fared so badly that he left the primaries to run as an independent. Another attacked me for being too old and was soundly defeated. The voters of the Democratic Party have voted. They have chosen me to be the nominee of the party.
As you can see, the president understands that this whole operation is terribly unfair. He won in 2020. He was the one behind the win in 2022. He has won the primaries. And to top it off, from a Democratic standpoint, he has been an incredibly effective president.
I'm the nominee of the Democratic Party, the only Democrat or Republican who has beaten Donald Trump ever. And I'm going to beat him again. I know him. Donald Trump is a loser.
Biden understands that in his first term, he's accomplished basically everything he promised, and doesn't understand why the hell he's now being asked to step aside. Now, has Biden really been such an effective president? Well, the answer is that it depends. From a Democratic voter's point of view, the answer is probably yes. He defeated Trump and has managed to push through a lot of initiatives, from the infrastructure bill to the chips and science bill, the second major coronavirus bailout, support for Ukraine, and the misnamed Inflation Reduction Bill. And doing all that in just 3 years is no small feat. Biden has launched the first major public industrial investment program in decades. What's more, the economic numbers have not been all bad either. Over the last 3.5 years, 15 million jobs have have been created, and investment in new factories, for instance, has skyrocketed. We've told you about all this at length on Visual Economic. Of course, wait a moment, because from a technical point of view, we can make a somewhat different reading. Biden's huge spending plans, especially the second huge pandemic bailout, fueled inflation to the point that it created the first inflationary crisis in the US for almost 40 years. Mind you, here, Trump was also largely to blame. But that's another topic. Biden has also not tackled the public deficit, which is already close to 6%, despite the fact that the economy is doing reasonably well. And this, coupled with higher interest rates, poses many problems for the future. But that's not all. It's one thing to write a bunch of checks with lots of zeros, and quite another to produce positive results. That is much more difficult. Why do I say this? Because the legislation the Democrats have pushed through is full of fine print. For example, if you're a company and you want to receive support from the new plans approved by the government, you're going to have to do a lot of things that have nothing to do with your business. For example, any company that wants to claim more than $150 million will have to pay for childcare for its employees. Preference will also be given to companies that invest in financing hospitals, nursery schools, or affordable apartment blocks. Likewise, preference will also be given to companies run by women, war veterans, and certain other minorities. On top of that, by law, the new hiring of workers in government-backed companies must be closely monitored by unions and other workers' organizations. And this, despite the fact that in the US, the unionization rate is barely 10%. And these are but just a few examples. In other words, we're talking about a huge burden of bureaucratic cholesterol that will only limit the effectiveness of all these plans. So yes, companies will not be as competitive, but government money will continue to pour in. It's perhaps the worst part of the White House-driven plans. But even accounting for that, I understand that for a Democratic voter, yes, we could say that this president has been quite effective. And yet, the point is that, despite everything, and despite the fact that he's turning a deaf ear to those who are calling on him to step down, Biden is standing alone. Basically, he's now only encouraged to continue by his most trusted circle, his wife, his son, and of course, many of his advisors, who would lose their position in the White House if Biden does not stay on. But guess what? This is no longer good enough. Basically, because the numbers no longer support this candidate. And without the numbers, he won't have the support of the party, nor will he have the support of many donors. Let's be clear, most polls say that nationally, Trump is ahead, and what's more, that gap, far from closing, is widening in most of them. It's true that there are other polls where Biden performs better. It's even likely that, if he were the candidate, he would win the popular vote. But that is not enough in the United States. In the United States, votes don't matter. What matters are the delegates you get when you win a state. And of all the states, there are only a few in play. And in those ones, the polls are devastating. Trump is winning each and every one of these swing states. And of course, nothing makes a politician more nervous than a bad poll. Many congressmen and senators who have their seats on the line in November see that, with Biden, they are not only risking the White House, they are also risking their seat. And that is definitely not the way they want to go. No way are they going to jump into the empty pool if they can help it. And that VisualPolitik community is exactly what has caused the political tsunami that is sweeping away the current occupant of the White House. Because Biden is no longer who he once was, and voters don't like his current state. Let's just say that the Biden of today is a far cry from the Biden we saw in 2016.
Not only do we have the largest economy in the world, we have the strongest economy in the world.
In fact, the latest data we have is that when voters in swing states are asked who they would choose between Trump or a younger Democratic candidate, then the numbers change dramatically from Biden's. In other words, that all signs point to this being about how Biden's candidacy has come to an end. We may be hours, or perhaps days, away from what seems inevitable: Joe Biden stepping aside and not running for re-election. You see, as things stand, and now I'm going to give you our opinion, stepping aside would be, by far, the most appropriate thing to do. Whether you like Biden or not, you may think he's been a good president or a bad president, but I think that if there's one thing that the vast majority of us will agree on, is that he no longer seems to have the energy, vitality, or drive that a position like this requires. Biden is old, and above all, he is very old. The frenetic agenda, the crises, the problems, the stress. The feeling is that he has been completely exhausted. He is totally drained. I don't want to imagine what the years to come could be like. And no, sorry, it's not that Biden has lost it, as they say out there, or anything like that. His speeches are clumsy, but he maintains his ideas. The Republicans themselves recognize that he has led the negotiations with Congress, and obviously his agenda, loaded with national and international commitments, has been very intense. Biden has not stood still. He has traveled much more than Donald Trump, for instance, and that logically is not a sign that he cannot meet his travel obligations. The problem is that all that has left him exhausted. Joe, think it over. The road has run its course, but I think you're perfectly aware of it yourself, or at least you're beginning to realize it. In fact, it was the president himself who recently publicly stated 3 possible scenarios for stepping aside: a medical recommendation, disastrous polls, or divine intervention.
I mean, if the Lord Almighty came down and said, "Joe, get out of the race," I'd get out of the race.
Obviously, the latter doesn't seem likely, but the other points are not far-fetched. You've already seen the disastrous polls, and the medical recommendation could come at any moment. Who knows? Perhaps the COVID recovery retreat is the right time to make this historic decision. So in short, we cannot guess the future, but Biden making it to November as a candidate seems highly unlikely. In fact, his retirement announcement is most likely imminent, and this news could be the tipping point.
Obama tells allies Biden needs to seriously consider his viability.
VisualPolitik community, Obama is still pulling strings. So far, he has been one of the big supporters, and without that support, everything could fall apart very quickly. Biden's exit from the election race appears imminent. And the big question is, who could replace Biden? Will a change be enough for the Democrats to even hope to beat Trump? Well, let's see. Here we have to make a distinction between what the Democrats would want and what they can have. I mean, there is one candidacy that the polls say would make a clean sweep, that could easily beat Trump by 15 points. We're talking about, surprising though it may be, Michelle Obama. Yes, that's right, Barack Obama's wife, who for some reason that escapes me personally, is tremendously popular. Yet Biden is the candidate. He has collected many donations for his candidacy, which is composed of him and his vice president Kamala Harris, who obviously is not willing to step aside either. So most likely, in an unexpected turn of events, Harris would ultimately be Trump's opponent. In fact, the Biden campaign has long been known to conduct polls to compare the electoral performance of a hypothetical Harris candidacy. Next, the Democrats have a huge base of relatively young governors and congressmen who could round out Harris's candidacy as vice presidents. We're talking about people like Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, or North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper. These guys could be absolutely crucial. And why? Well, because they could bolster the Democratic choices in all of these states, which would be completely decisive in this big battle that is coming up. This would be another advantage that the Harris candidacy would have over the Biden candidacy. Not surprisingly, everything indicates that the change of cards would improve the Democrats' prospects, because they can't get any worse. Of course, here on VisualPolitik, we'll be paying very close attention to everything that happens. But for now, the question is over to you. Do you think Biden should step down? And do you think trading cards could improve the Democrats' chances of keeping the White House? As always, leave us your thoughts in the comments, and let's get ready for a particularly high wattage debate. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll see you next time.